Welcome again. And before we start, let's do our best to set a motivation for the session. Do what we can to recollect the uh, the needs of all beings, um, in whichever stage or state they're in, um, and to develop a sense of loving kindness and a sort of a familial relationship, sort of like a fraternity or equivalent, and to develop that sense of responsibility for them so that we may then feel able to or wish to take on some responsibility or shoulder the responsibility for working for the needs and the benefit of all beings, and then recognizing that, however far off it may seem, that as a Buddha we'd be able to benefit spontaneously with great clarity and according to the specific needs without our own agendas muddling or being influenced by others muddling our views. So being able to be a Buddha gives us the insight and the ability to meet the specific needs of the individuals in their own language, according to their own terms. That's what we're working to develop, and I'm hoping that this session we can keep that in mind and use anything that we learn or that inspires us from it to help us develop a greater strength of responsibility towards ourselves, but also towards sentient beings for that purpose. So thank you. So today we're still on karma. We finished last week. We finished talking about the strength of karma and how it and what various different aspects of it make it strong or weak. And this week we're talking about the fruitional effects, the way in which effects are related to karma. So this is, in a sense, is often what people use the word for karma to be about. Is, my karma is this, and they're talking about really the fruition of their karma or what, or whatever. And as I said, there's, in a sense, this understanding of karma is really missing out on a much larger context of the ramifications and the patterns and the consequences of our actions as they go out into society, go out into the world, um, uh, uh, and also the psychological moments that affect us. The sort of the ongoing change in our mind as we commit, as we have these thoughts or make these actions, and how they affect our subsequent actions and our subsequent thoughts. So these are also, I was saying, a karma. With their actions, and they have consequences, their causes, and they're ones which immediately go out, escape into the universe. And then in traditional Buddhist context, there are those actions which affect us in terms of the energy that we've put in, that affect us in terms of where we go in future lives as well. So the future lives, again, I said there's two ways. There's a sort of a modern psychological way of looking at this, if you like, which is actually found in traditional texts, if you look hard enough, where there's this corresponding moment to moment of time representing a rebirth of consciousness. The moment of consciousness and the cause of consciousness is said within a Buddhist context to be the prior moment of consciousness. So this is where we develop this mental continuum. It doesn't mean that there's there can't be a gap, a temporal gap between one moment to the next moment. That moment will reoccur when the circumstances are right. Like I said about a whirlpool. So with that sort of thing, then what we're looking at here is primarily talking about the effect over lives, not just anything else. And Lama Tsongkhapa says that this is the effects again, as we've talked, there's the different strengths of the karma, but also all of these negative karmas are basically depend upon the three mental poisons. So three mental poisons at the root of all of all delusions are ignorance and um, uh, uh, the intention to harm and the intention to grab, to hold, attachment, aversion, and ignorance. Not just any ignorance, ignorance specifically of the way things are, ignorance of the truth. And specifically the truth that we're interested in is that which frees us from grasping onto things as if they are graspable. Right? Imagining that if I have that ice cream, it will make me um, a happy person, not just while I'm eating the ice cream, but it'll make me a happy person. I need that ice cream in order to be happy. So in that sense, it's like there's a grasping onto this idea that some sort of basis of pleasure in the ice cream, rather than recognizing that we have we have some sort of ability to sustain or understand our experience from the mental side rather than from the um, just from the stimulus side. And given that also that if I really think about it, I can see that eating ice cream more occasionally might be very pleasant. If I eat a lot of ice cream, then I can end up with diabetes and obesity and all these other problems, and toothache and so on. So these sorts of things show that ice cream itself isn't a cause of happiness; it's a cause of all sorts of other things as well. So when we see specifically even something like ice cream, then it doesn't seem to be so attractive to us initially. But as at a naive level, it's very easy to see how chocolate or ice cream or these sort of things give us some sort of instant pleasure, right? Um, and it's as a child, it's sort of hard to reconcile, to recognize that this delicious ice cream is also the cause of all my suffering when I come down off that huge sugar high and start feeling miserable and tired and don't know how to deal with it. So these sorts of correlations we can see and we can experience them. So what we're really saying is when we really see what's in these things, they lose their charm or they lose their horror, their fearfulness, their terror, scariness as well. So we this is what we're trying to work on, is developing this lack of ignorance. So these three things here are the causes that reach out for us in Buddhist tanha, is sort of thirst to trying to grasp onto or grasp away from stimuluses or phenomena. And when we do that, then we have a tendency to let go of our ability to sustain an ethical mind. We just become dominated, our actions become dominated by our fears or our anxieties or our lust or our needs. So in that sense, not physical needs, our sort of desire needs. Yeah. So he says here anyway, within these, generally there's the idea, there's a very simple, straightforward, indicative idea rather than necessarily to be taken as this is always the ways. There's a fruitional action is normally tied to the idea that's saying that if the great, the very, very strong actions of, for instance, killing and so on, generally lead to hell rebirth. We've talked about hell before. And then in the medium sense, then you can be reborn as a hungry ghost or an animal. And some sutras, like the level of yogic deed, says you first, it sort of it stages the hell is the worst, and then the ghost, and then the animal. Whereas the sutra in the 10 level says, in fact, um, the hells, but then the next one up is the animal, and then the next one up is the ghost. But he says these sorts of things are really much more indicative than they are specific in this sense. So there are two types of sort of effects. There, I mean, not just two. There are actually a few different effects of the way in which these karmic effects arise. Ones are called causally concordant. In other words, like the action, in accordance with the action. And an example of that is that one of the effects of killing is that your lifetimes will become shorter until as a sort of a consequence of killing. Um, in a sense, a lot of this might sound a bit sort of magical, but what we're really saying is that if you have a disregard for life, then a lack of respect for life and a lack of or you're engaged in preventing somebody, disempowering somebody from or some being from their life, then in many ways, this psychological effect will be that you will have less value in your life and you will die younger. So we don't need to necessarily think it's some sort of, again, as I said, magic. There is a very strong correlation in terms of the way in which these things work. And again, stealing leads to a lack of resources and so on. So I can be more specific, and he uses two. He uses a short, a brief version, and a longer version, but they're saying basically the same sort of thing here. And he's depending here on the sutra on the 10 levels. I think it's a Mahayana Sutra, and the chapter of the Truth Speaker is another Mahayana Sutra here. It says also with killing, then there's and not only a shortened lifespan, but also as illnesses. Stealing is a few resources, and those resources you do have will be shared or will be taken by others. If sexual misconduct is, then your helpers and those people, your group, your friendship group and your family group will be disorderly, untrustworthy, and it suggests that you'll have a contentious or difficult spouse. Lying is the tendency to find people will be and yourself will be slanderous and deceptive. Divisiveness is again the same group. Your family and friends won't get on with each other or misbehave and hurt each other. Offensive speech is continually finding yourself feeling offended by and being offended, again within your friendship group, but also in the environment. Senseless speech is the idea, for instance, that your words are not understandable by others, or and wouldn't be respected, and that you don't have an unshakable or strong confidence. And covetousness is the idea of a great attachment and no contentment. Malice is always looking to do sort of seeking harmful things and have no interest in beneficial things and no sort of particular regard as to whether or not one is harming or being harmed. And wrong views is it's hard to be able to trust anything as being reliable, and very hard to see any truth, very hard to understand things that are happening around us. So, and even when we sort of think we have an answer, then it seems to dissolve or not work for us. So it's very difficult for us to feel secure or safe in terms of our learnings or our understandings. So now these sorts of things, again, in fact, in many ways are like we can see in terms of, and we'll go into environmental effects too, but in terms of this, a lot of this is to do with our social environment. And we can see that obviously if I am a liar, then I will see liars wherever I am. There's years ago, there was a story about a jay in Cambridge. It's a Cambridge psychology group who were looking at the jays in the local woodland, at the bird jays. And the jays, they used the jays because they wanted them in the wild because they didn't want the laboratory to take effect. And they wanted they decided to use jays because jays are like humans in the sense that they watch the gaze of those other jays in the area. They're aware of our eyes. They have a very similar of their eyes, a very similar way of looking at the world in this particular sense. And what's interesting is they saw that there are sort of two communities of jays in the same woodland. Um, One were very busy, arduous, picking up all sorts of little bits of food and so on, and putting them into stores for hard times. There's plenty of fruit and food, but it's quite natural just to squirrel away, as they say, a little cache of food for hard times. Of course, the thing is um, that there are other jays who there's quite a lot of work involved in doing this, going off, finding food, bringing it back to the cache. And there are other jays who just watched, and then when the jay flew off to do some more, he'd go into those caches and nick the food from those caches and put it into their own cache. So yeah, there are thieving jays and working jays is one way of looking at it. Yes, okay. And so yeah, it's not just humans, right? We've got or creatures are able to do this, or animals are able to have this sort of same sort of things. So then, what they were remarking about, which is so interesting, is that the robbing jays, the thieving jays, would always, when they came to put the food into their cache, they would pretend to put it in, and then they'd go somewhere else and pretend to put it somewhere else, and then pretend to put it somewhere else. And then one of those would be the place where the food was. And they were doing this because they were aware of the fact that there were thieving jays. Whereas the hard-working jays never did that. They just always put it into the same cache, right? The same, their same place. So they sort of felt quite secure that there's nobody will steal this stuff because they're not used to the idea that people are going to steal their stuff. But the thieves, they're very aware that anybody can steal their stuff. So they're looking all the time for thieves, right? So we can see from this is an animal. We can see from this that creatures who are prone to thieving will see thieves wherever they are. And likewise, we see this with all these other forms of wrong action. And some of them will be legitimately there, and some of them will not be legitimately there. But in the end, they have to face this lack of trust in their environment that the hardworking jay has. So in terms of ease of mind, although the thieving jays have an easier time getting the food, they actually have a difficult time dealing with their mental concerns that their food's going to be stolen, right? So that's sort of one of the ways in which we can see how this karma works in terms of the reflection of the environment in which we're in, depending upon the actions that we take place in. Yeah. So maybe it's not too clear. I'm trying hard to show how we can see that even from a state of the mind, this repeated action leads to an energy or a carves, if you like, our minds into a particular direction, carves our force into a particular direction that will carry on through time. So uh, one of the things we can also see is that when, let's say, for instance, a hardworking jay finds that all the food's gone from their cache, or they see a thieving jay steal from their cache, they'll be upset, right? This is like, I've done all this work and it's all just been stolen. And once they made that connection, that upset may lead them to become thieves. So we can see here the problem of social karma, where we see that what it might seem like not so harmful to steal has actually now created more a culture of stealing. Yeah, and this is really why we have to be so aware of the fact that the smallest of actions that we take, even sort of small, simple, tiny actions sometimes can have these very, very strong corresponding effects across the world. So this is why we really do need to think of this. This was mentioned earlier on in terms of how karma expands. So yeah, in a sense, what he's saying is, Lama Tsongkhapa is saying here, and he's quoting the chapter of the Truth Speaker and the Sutra on the 10 Levels, these Mahayana sutras from Buddha, is he's saying that one way of reading this is he's saying that if you develop these mindsets will follow you around. You know, you can't just abandon your luggage. It's one of these lovely fantasies, sort of we unconscious fantasies we have, that we can somehow let go of all the luggage we come in. You know, oh yeah, oh I'm all over that, and I'm finished with that one. It's like, yeah, really, luggage needs to be worked on. So we can't imagine really that um, you know, people often run away from a situation, and of course they forget they're carrying with them the luggage that they brought from that situation, or brought into that situation. It's just changing the scenery. It doesn't really necessarily change the mind, right? Otherwise, Buddha would have said, you know, go on for a nice tour around the country this year, or change house once a year, or whatever it is, because then we can just abandon all the luggage as we go along. But he didn't say that. He didn't say that at all. So yeah, you have to think that sort of way. So again, then he talks about environmental effects, and this is sort of the environment within which we're in, is such that, for instance, if you're killing, then um, things like food and drink, medicine, fruits. Fruits is it's used a lot here, and fruits is not just necessarily meaning apples and pears. It really means fruits of one's actions, in terms of today. So the work that I put into my projects, like that, projects of, you know, fruits of my projects rather. So they'll have little strength, they'll be ineffective, they won't have very much power or potency, they'll be hard to digest, and they'll induce illness. So in a sense, this idea of decay and lack of strength or power, but because one's engaging in disempowering activity of a very, very high order. Disempowering somebody of their life is about as disempowering as one can get. And of course, all the other ramifications with it in terms of the misery that's caused by it. So these sorts of things are like saying, yeah, this is going to have the effect of really reducing uh, the strength of or support that we would want, we would hope for. And stealing is like you have few, there's less, they won't be correct, they'll change, everything is going to be slightly spoilt. The land in which you might be in will be droughts or downpours. And then sexual misconduct is again to do with the idea of a lack of cleanliness and a lack of order and a lack of a sort of complete, you know, and giving up of care, like, or consideration. So then lying is that work that you do doesn't flourish, it doesn't even start to flourish. There's a lack of harmony, um, uh, and there's a sense of um, feeling cheated by the government or whatever, which might be real, but there's a never really feeling able to be aware of what's going on in terms of relying on speech in this case. Divisive speech is said to be bumpy and craggy and uneven and hard to traverse. An offensive speech, you know, you actually caused offense, it hurt deliberately out to harm people. It's, thorns and logs and sharp stones and a lack of waterfalls and lakes and ponds. Dangerous animals and so on. Sensitive speech is where things are not, that don't appear to be sensible. So fruit trees look nice, but in fact the fruit's poison. Nothing is really necessarily as it seems. Like unripe food appears to be ripe, ripe food appears to be unripe. So an example of this was Geshe said this. He said to me, and there's a sort of a joke. It wasn't being too serious, but you know, bell peppers, right? So bell peppers is normally you've got red bell peppers and green bell peppers. And the idea, what he said, is like, um, uh, these green ones, they look like they're unripe, but they're actually not unripe. So this is like, maybe this is because of all this senseless speech that you find in the West, because we never had bell peppers in Tibet, he'd say. So, and then I say, I say, well, that might be the case, but in Tibet, it must have been lots of people being very offensive and saying nasty things to each other because there are all these big rocks and sharp stones. So we're playing, yeah. We're not like being deadly serious here. Anyway, so again, also there's a lot of this is the idea of saying there's fear. Fear is one of the consequences. Fearfulness is one of the consequences of non-virtuous actions in terms of the environment that we're in will cause us fear. And he says, and we're talking about that in terms of covetousness, wanting to grasp, and basically leads to sort of everything deteriorating and so on. And there is a sort of correspondence here with the hungry ghosts. So essentially, there is a strong covetousness has a strong tendency towards bringing an environment which is similar to that of the hungry ghosts. And likewise, this sort of idea of malice, having lots of harmful diseases and animals and poisons and all these sorts of things, right? So, like you possibly one could argue, I don't know, but one could argue that maybe one of the karmic consequences or ripenings of of find at the moment is in the world is out of malice has led to all this radioactive dust from the big nuclear explosions that China, that well, all of the nuclear nations were involved with, including America and so on. So these have created now this thin layer of radiation in the atmosphere. And again, wrong views primarily is there's no home, no protector, no refuge. And this is really important because the idea, remember we talked earlier about how, for me anyway, for the idea of refuge in terms of not just the spiritual refuge, but also our domestic refuge. So these sorts of things suggest that possibly wrong view leads us into these states. Again, one could argue, well, that sounds a little bit very traditional Buddhist, and in many ways it is. I mean, this is found in all of the different traditions of Buddhism. But again, the point about this is not for us to then say, "Oh, look, that person is, that person is disabled, so they must have been they're a killer, and their karma is working out on them," because all of these karmic seeds are in all of us, right? So one of the aspects of that is essentially um, these seeds require the conditions in order to ripen. Some of them are very strong, and you might find yourself in a position where they ripen very, very quickly, but others are less strong and they require specific opportunity to arise. And then, of course, you see many people suffering at the same time because all have that karma. They all have the karma that can now be ripened. Um, or they've all committed, if you like, that karma, which now the fruit of which can now be ripened, because the circumstances have arisen. So it doesn't mean that they were necessarily a group or there was anything special about them as a group. It just happens that they all shared a similar um, uh, uh, um, set of prior causes, which are now uh, um, arising. For us to judge an individual by a victim judgment is a mistake. It's a wrong view. So we've got to be very careful of recognizing that the nature of this is that, well, as they say, in the West, there, but for the grace of God go I, and this is much that we don't really have as Buddhists. There's not really much in the way of grace of God, but the sentiment is very similar. Um, so he said, okay, well, these are primarily so far I've been talking about in terms of non-virtuous actions, and there's also the same with the virtuous actions. And most of these are reflected very strongly in terms of um, the negative the opposite context. So he says specifically here again, there are those aspects of the virtuous actions and their effects, which are restraining, choosing to restrain at that moment, being aware of the fact that I am at the moment possibly about to kill, and then saying, no, this is not what I'm going to go into. Now, we've discussed it before earlier, but generally, the earlier one is able to capture that, the easier it is to stop it. So um, it's like we're sort of at the top, the peak of at the apex of a very narrow mountain, if you like, or a sort of triangle. And then once we've determined which way we go, if we go down the left, or I don't know, I'm left-handed, but we go to the left side, for instance, there's normally the sinister side, then this one then leads to, it's harder for us to climb back up and go over, right? So if we need to, this is why we need to be mindful and vigilant, is because if we can capture it at the moment while we're still on the apex, then we've got a choice. We've got a choice as to whether or not to continue. But once we go down that, this is normally at the mental level, once we go down a particular intention, then the chances are that we'll take action. And at that point, we fail. But the virtuous action is actually choosing the other path, choosing, if you like, in this case, this is the right hand side, the right path. So um, um, uh, not that I'm leftist or rightist, I'm just saying this is one way of looking at it. So um, uh, he says, but otherwise, in terms of the way in which they work, they're all the mechanisms for virtuous actions are exactly the same, in the sense that one is one can talk about the basis and the attitude, the performance and the combination, and so on, and all of these are precisely the same, but in the virtuous sense. And again, there is also, rather than just restraint, there is also active benefit. So this is where we work on, for instance, actions that reduce killing, or help people see, question killing, or reduce crime or theft, or helps to bring people together, and brings communities together. So actions which are actually helping people to see more clearly, be more kind, be more considerate. These are all linked to the sort of virtuous actions, right? So positive community activity is very strong. It's very powerful. Just and and meets those sort of the requirements of virtuous actions. So if we find ways of being able to help people think, say, I don't know, about the importance of marriage, or for sexual misconduct, for instance, and also then so that they will then restrain, or consider at least, or begin to doubt whether or not it's okay to do what these negative things, then we've really benefited. We've really helped make a difference. So it's not necessarily saying you've got to be a Buddhist, or my ideas are best, or always have some sort of fable or ethical story to tell, or to shove it. They need to buy into it. They need to understand it, and accept it. So that's part of the mission, in a sense, is to say, how can we engage in a way which demonstrates, not persuades, or coerces, but demonstrates and opens up a view where we can see the benefits of doing well. And then he talks about the various different effects of virtuous actions are the effect, the fruits of. Because he so far he says, I haven't really talked very much about the virtuous, but it's not that they're not there. So he said it's just easier for us to relate to non-virtuous directly, rather than necessarily in terms of restraint, and also in terms um, of encouraging action, if you like, positive action in that sense. So he says primarily the fruitional effect of virtuous actions is rebirth as a human or a deity, in the desire realm, or even in one of the higher realms, depending on higher deity realms, form and formless realms, depending on the strength and focus of your virtuous actions. So as I seem to remember, if one is very ethical, very ethical indeed, then one can find oneself being born into these Brahma realms, and especially into the desire realms. And for instance, if you practice of a very strong practice of loving kindness and compassion, and a strong wish to help all the time, this leads to rebirth the uh, in the desire realms. The higher realms, form and formless, also require some form of meditation practice. But this, in Buddhist context, this is not really recommended too much. What we're looking for is to be reborn, where we can continue our Dharma practice. So our Dharma practice requires us to be in an environment where we can continue to empathize and connect with um, teachers and teachings, but also to have at least some sense of suffering, so we can understand the compassion that we will then be able to relate to the deeper underlying suffering of samsara. So it's a bit hard for us initially when we're starting our path as a child to recognize the suffering of samsara, but what we can do is recognize coarse suffering, which opens our mind to compassion. And therefore, human rebirth is often far better for us in terms of our spiritual path than being born in some sort of heavenly environment. Um, and being born in these does not mean wherever we're born, we are still subject to death and rebirth. So we get reborn somewhere else. And again, he says, basically, just thinking in terms of concordant environmental effects, they're pretty much the opposite of those of the non-virtuous action. So whereas killing was like everything is short, if you not kill, then you get a long life, you have healthy life, medicine's very effective, there's lack of disease. These sorts of things are indicative of having restrained from negative actions. So I can see in myself, I might be wrong, but from what I can see in myself is that I've been the last few lifetimes, I've restrained from killing. Yeah, so I've got a good, strong life, very healthy body. What I don't have is I can also see is where I've not been so good. So, for instance, a tendency to idle gossip, and this means that a lot of people don't understand what I'm talking about. Or don't listen to me. So this is like, and don't have so much respect for me. So this is because the respect thing, again, this is sort of like to do with a sense of not being able to provide reliable uh, talking. So a tendency towards possibly lying or not being particularly honest, possibly even offensive and senseless speech. These are things that I think I had in previous lifetimes. So I can see this a little bit, maybe not, maybe I'm just imagining it. So these sorts of things that would reflect on some of the aspects of my life that I've experienced in a way which I can begin to say, okay, there's maybe some correlation there. And he says, you know, of course, the best one really is as we, and this is from the Sutra of the 10 Levels, that when we have cultivated all of these 10 virtuous actions correctly, if we have done this through a fear of samsara, fear of cyclic existence, but without great compassion, in other words, we feel compassion, very strong compassion, but not great compassion, not to the point where we want to take responsibility for the suffering of others, we will then definitely achieve the fruit of a Sravaka, an arhat. And this is not saying it'll happen next life, but it's available to us. Those who are also without great compassion, but who wish to become Buddhas, when they understand dependent arising, which comes in a few chapters' time, dependent arising clearly, of which the basis is karma, they then will achieve the state of a solitary hero, Pratyeka Buddha, a Buddha. And then those who have practiced these with great compassion, with skillful means, with great aspirational prayers, never abandoning any single living being, always being, yeah, you know, our compassion needs to reach all beings, regardless of the time or their nature, right? Every being without exception. So like that. And when focusing on the vast and sublime wisdom of a Buddha, then they will achieve the level of a bodhisattva, and then they will be able to achieve and develop the perfections. And through practicing these perfections as a bodhisattva a great deal, they will eventually achieve the qualities of a Buddha. So becoming a Buddha, a Mahayana bodhisattva Buddha, is much more takes much longer time than Pratyeka or Sravaka Buddha, but the benefits are much greater too. So he says this is primarily these two things are basically the two. Although I was very brief on the virtuous actions, these are the two sets of the paths of action along with their effects. And he says most of this has come from the levels of the yogic deeds and the compendium of determinations, two of these texts on karma. But he says there's also, it's worthwhile for us to discuss the distinction between projecting karma and completing karma. And also karma whose result we'll definitely or only possibly experience. And so this is sort of the idea of no karma as action, so the fruits of which will definitely or only possibly experience. So he said, first of all, so this is like, we're coming to the end of karma, so I say that, which we've still got quite a way. So the distinction between projection and completion karma is based on the idea of whether or not a karma puts us, determines which rebirth we're going to have. So where we're going to be reborn and what sort of animal or being that we're going to be when we're reborn. And completing karma is to do with the way in which how the consequences actually affect that state. So there's two ideas primarily here: is the way in which we can be reborn as a human but suffer consequences of our actions, and then where we can be actually reborn as in the hells or whatever, and suffer the consequences of those actions according to completing karma as well. So he says one of the things about this, in terms of, this is very much all about rebirth now. So if you find this hard, then that's okay. But I want to still go through it according to what Lama Tsong-kha-pa writes. So with rejecting karma, then if your karma is good, then you'll be reborn in a happy realm. You'll be born as a human or good realm. If your karma is good, and the projecting karma of negative non-virtuous action will lead to a miserable realm. Okay, so the idea is very straightforward in the end, that if you kill and there's projecting karma involved, then you'll be reborn in one of the low realms. Um, However, you can still have, he said, with completing karma, this is not determined which, there's no determination at all as to which realm you're going to be reborn in. You can be reborn in any realm, and the completing karma can still take place. And he says, for instance, non-virtuous actions, which he's talked about before, can lead to things such as a short lifespan, lots of illnesses, poverty, all sorts of other things. So these sorts of things here are indicative of completing karma, and likewise virtuous actions can create sort of like a lot of wealth as an animal. So you can be a very wealthy animal, or a very wealthy or comfortable, animal with a lovely palace and all the food that they could possibly need. Like you think, maybe the Queen's corgis, right? They have a very, very lovely life. And this is possibly, one could argue, this is because this is the fruition of a consummate of completing karma is happening here. So this is just not saying that we don't have it, but this is just they had the opportunity for it, right? So these sorts of aspects there. So he says this, he then goes through a sort of logical progression where he says, you can have one and you can have both of the others, and you can have the others and you can have both of these. So primarily there's nothing that just because you're born in a high realm doesn't necessarily mean you don't have negative karma that will ripen during that time. Says the only thing is that with completing karma, then they can have lots of different ramifications, lots of different sort of ways in which that the results can arise or ripen according to circumstance, and also according to your own relationships and according to everything like that. Um, and even sometimes, like if you think, sometimes there is an aspect of what you did which is good, and there's an aspect which is not so good. So then you have both of these ripening. Whereas with projection karma, generally the action will only project to one place. You won't have it where it says, okay, any realm, or it can, both the hell realm and the heaven realm. This doesn't happen. He says there's a single relationship with the karma in terms of the action, in terms of projection. So this is from a Sangha, Compendium of Knowledge of Sangha. So he says the four types of karma here is a single instant of an action nourishing a seed of a single lifetime's fruition. That action of nourishing a seed of many lifetimes' fruition, and so on. I think for me, it's a bit, without going into lots of detail, it's a bit meaningless, but this is available, both from the commentaries, but also here, where he's really talking about the idea of saying how different things, the actions can also be sort of grouped together so that you have lots of projecting a karma together will create a result, and likewise lots of fruitional karma together can create a single result, but also sometimes the other way around, where um, a single action can actually create all sorts of other correlating results. So it's not just one or the other. So then he talks about this idea about, and we're going back to intention here, intentionality. And we have to be, this is something that I feel we'll have to be very, very careful with, and is actually really quite complex. So he says here that essentially the fruition of what you will definitely experience as in terms of rebirth, in terms of on oneself through karmic weight, is that which is consciously done and accumulated. So here he says essentially there needs to be an awareness that I've done it. So if I inadvertently tread on a mouse, for instance, then he's saying it's not clear whether or not the killing of the mouse will bring to fruition. However, um, this is really, I sort of slightly struggle with this, because if we look at that in one sense and say, well, actually, it depends, because if I'm not being if I'm being if I'm neglecting, or I'm not being considerate of my environment, my circumstances, if I'm not taking care, if I'm being careless, um, then despite the fact that I haven't deliberately caused, acknowledged or even aware of the fact that I've killed a mouse, there is obviously a consequence to the fact of my lack of care, my lack of attention, my lack of consideration. And therefore, in these situations, and I think most lamas would agree with me here, it's just that Lama Tsongkhapa doesn't go into it in any detail. In these circumstances, there is no doubt that there will be a consequence to it, right? There's going to be consequence both in karma, in terms of completion across other lives, but also in terms of the situation which I'm in right now, in terms of the world. And we think about this also in terms of things like saying, it's hard to accept that if I kill somebody, let's say a child, unknowingly while I'm driving a car, and I am distracted by a joke on the radio while I'm in the car, and I kill that child, that there is not going to be any consequences to it. Right? It's just not going to happen. Of course, there are consequences. It's going to be it. There's going to be a huge amount of suffering for the family, for the extended family, for myself, for society, and of course for the poor child. So in that sort of sense, I think we have to take into consideration that while intentionality obviously has a very, very strong effect in terms of its consequences, deliberately choosing to run over to kill a child is going to really require a dramatic mental poison for me to want to do that, then against lack of attention, yeah, due care and attention. Without these are both terrible, but one of them is considerably more dramatic in terms of the aggressive mental state. So both of these will have huge consequences. And for me, I can't really accept that mere consciousness of it alone is enough for us to say to say uh, whether or not there will be a future effect is indeterminate. Of course, it will be determinate as far as I see it. However, there is the idea of also there's a distinction to be made between what's done and what's been accumulated, and this is very much to do with intentions. So um, there are four ways you can have that which is done, and that which is accumulated, that which is not done, and that which is accumulated, that which is accumulated, not done, and that which is neither done nor accumulated, right? So of these, he says that essentially karma which is accumulated is the karma, let's say the accumulated karma for killing, which did not lead to killing, is like where you plan to kill, or you dream of killing, or you're playing a game in which you kill a king or whatever. And it says generally in this sense, because the killing doesn't happen, there's no karma going to be ripening from the lack of killing. Killing in a dream, killing a king in a game of chess is not a killing, right? There's no killing taking place. I mean, although your opponent in the game of chess might feel unhappy because his king's died, he's lost the game, or she's lost the game. There's no karma of killing involved in this at all. So, I mean, you could say maybe a little bit of wasting one's time, but in terms of the act of killing, there's not taking place. A planning of killing, I want to, the intention to kill um, itself with malice is a malicious activity, and itself planning on killing itself has a series of major consequences to it, but it doesn't include the actual killing. So the distinction he's making here is to say that the accumulation of karma that was intended to lead to killing itself be filled with all sorts of different types of bad karma. But the actual action in the specific case of the killing itself did not take place. So therefore, that killing won't ripen. But the consequences of the planning will, definitely. There's no doubt here. So it's not like we're saying, oh, it's okay to plan to assassinate the president or whatever. You know, that's fine. It's, you know, it's only when you do it that it doesn't matter. It's not like that at all. The planning to assassinate the president is not good at all. So yeah, when we do something completely unknowingly, unconsciously, without intensity or not continuously, uh, then the effect is dramatically diminished. But it depends, and as I said again, this depends very much upon circumstances and what that means in terms of saying whether or not I could be more conscious, whether I could be more considerate, whether or not I could be more aware, whether or not I could be more careful, then those sorts of things are definitely changing. In terms of, again, what we're really trying to do is to talk about the idea of a specific instance of karma taking place outside of the corresponding circumstances. So it's again also done in error, or being doing something that you didn't want to do, or being coerced. So one of the aspects of this is, say, if you're coerced into doing something that you would not otherwise do, then the karma is not attached to it. If you're led to believe, you know, if you're an honest sort of person, you're led to believe that you're coerced into a situation where you are told something and you act upon that in good faith, having been told you need to do that, and it was something you would never otherwise do, then that action is diminished. In fact, a lot of the responsibility goes upon the person who persuaded you to do it. So we need to be aware. Of course, there are still consequences. One will feel remorse when one discovers the truth. You know, I had no idea that I did that, and that will have a very strong effect on us, and also on our minds. But having strong remorse and recognizing this, in a sense, actually can mature us. And there's a lot of that aspect of it, which, in a sense, can be beneficial to us. There is still damage done. If I steal inadvertently because I've been coerced, I've been part of a con, I will feel a lot of suffering, or I will feel a remorse because I took part in something I didn't mean to take part in. And I will become more aware of that in my future, and I will be damaged by it. Of course, I will feel very, very damaged by it, but it will prevent it may prevent this from me being so naive in the future again. Um, of course, the karma of those people who have instigated this, or person who's instigated this con, or this uh, um, persuasion, is very deep indeed and very dark. So it's not as if it's you know, there's no free lunch. But definitely, we can also, he says, you know, we can actually remedy. There are ways in which we can remedy our actions, and we can do these. And a part of that is through regret, real a decision not to do it again, and so on. And these can help to mitigate the long-term effects. And the greatest and the most powerful way to eradicate this, which we'll talk about later on, I think probably next week, is through um, um, meditation specifically on emptiness, not because um, not because it's some wonderful sort of philosophy, but basically emptiness is it cuts through all of these attachments, the grasping, the hunger that causes so much trouble. So that helps us to weaken and break the seeds of our karma. So he then goes into some of this, for instance, using again, as ever, killing as a model rather than as the only one, in terms of the permutations. So done but not accumulated is things like done in a dream, not done unintentionally, when you've been coerced, done against your will, that you've done once and then regretted. So some of these, in terms of things like that you've done once and then regretted, this does have a consequence. There's always going to be a consequence to that. But those which are done in a dream, or those that are done in idle thought, sort of without any malice or desire, they're just just flitting rubbish that comes through our head sometimes. All that is in a game, for instance, these things don't have no meaningful consequence. But definitely, we can see also that the idea is that that being complete unconscious, but also being aware. So if we are conscientious, we are careful, and a killing still occurs through accident, let's say, then there is still a consequence in the world. But in terms of our general karma, in terms of wishing to develop a killing nature, is not there. It's not present, right? We don't want to kill. It was complete inadvertent. And in fact, there's this huge sense of remorse and discomfort about the fact that we may have killed accidentally. And he says yes, and again, if we were able to destroy the seed generated by a former killing through the supramundane path of elimination, now that actually requires us to be an Arya. We need to be a bodhisattva, enlightened bodhisattva, for us to be able to actually destroy that. But that's what allows for us to be able to become a Buddha. So with one that is accumulated but not done is, again, I've said some of this already, you investigate and analyze for a long time in order to with a deliberate mission to kill a being, but then you don't. So again, the lack of the killing itself means there's no consequence for the lack of killing, but there is still the planning. There are consequences to that, and the malice, definitely there's consequences to that. If there's anything else, anything that is done consciously, done with planning, done whatever, that's killing with, this obviously, this is a killing. And he says if there's neither accumulation and it was neither done, then that obviously that's anything else, which is nothing at all, right? So if I close a book, there's no killing getting involved in that. Unless there's a poor insect, then it's an accidental killing. So he says then the three mental non-virtuous actions don't have the permutation, the second permutation, which is to do with is accumulation without doing it, in the sense that one can't really accumulate malice and not have done it, because the accumulation of malice is malice. So it's pretty straightforward, really. It's not too complicated in this sense. And then he says, okay, then the other thing is there's a time at which we experience this, and we have this sort of, this is about as close as we get to instant karma within the Lamrim tradition. He says you can sometimes experience it in the here and now, and this sounds like, oh, immediately, and it's not. It means within this life. So some sorts of things can, for instance, with our meditation practice, we can develop our meditation to the point where we're able to begin to really diminish and destroy some of the karma, the karmic problems that we've made through our practice. Again, this is why, in a sense, our virtuous action is so precious. We need to be keep so aware of being not making mistakes, because it affects everything that happens in the universe, right? So this is really so important to us. But he says also, likewise, we can see that when we become if we have overwhelming actions, overwhelmingly powerful actions, that our mind becomes destroyed in them. There's no doubt that if we become a killer and we become to start enjoying and killing, we can see the mind becomes destroyed in the process. So mass murderers and so on, they no longer have a safe mind. They become destroyed, and they begin to see all sorts of serious issues with their lives begin to decay. So it's not at all easy in that way. And then he says another time is when you've been reborn, when this is really meaning in the next life. And then there are those other times. So these are the three times. And this is like beyond the next life. That's all. And there's the idea that sometimes some particular karmas will ripen when they'll ripen, and it's generally those the strongest will ripen earlier. Um, But then also what happens is those which are affected at the moment of death. So if we are able to sustain a happy mind at the moment of death, then it's very unlikely that that we'll be reborn in a low rebirth in our next life. So it's quite good if we can to keep a happy mind, especially at the deathbed. And this is when we're working with our relatives and friends also, if we can try to keep them calm and not to sort of upset the dying person, and that can really help actually make a difference. Um, but also what we're saying really is that and which I've mentioned a few times, is that it's not just the weight of the karma, but it's also the opportunity for that karma to be ripened. You need the right circumstances for this sort of karma, completing karma, to arise. And therefore this will have an effect in terms of opportunity effect. So the environment is more complex. We have to remember that really, in a sense, where we are born will be in effect very much delivered according to the circumstances of our own nature. But not there's no, because it's a rising in terms of there's no sort of spirit traveling from one place to another. So and there's no necessary time involved in this at all. Then what we can see is when the occasion arises for when I die, well, the occasion arises for when I can be reborn, then that will happen. But that's going to be indicated very strongly by the by the nature of my actions. So in terms of how I'm ripen and where I ripen and with what nature I ripen, this is going to be affected very much in that sense. And we hear sometimes of lamas saying, okay, well, where they have a choice about where they're going to be reborn. When you're sort of very highly realized, and there might be some ability to do that, but for us there isn't, not much at all. We can try our best to be happy, and if we're good, then we can avoid some places. So then he talks about saying, well, what are the benefits of sustaining the virtuous actions? And he says there are sort of basically eight. He says it's certainly the case that you will acquire a good body and mind, and in a very good environment, through giving up the 10 non-virtues. Um, However, he also says that if you can bring about this body and mind in a fully qualified sense, in other words, within the context of consideration of, for instance, um, even a low level of compassion and bodhicitta, there's no doubt also this accelerates your cultivation of the path. like nothing else. So he says, therefore, what we need to recognize is that the 10 virtuous actions primarily are the engine, is the fuel that drives our engine in terms of our journey to enlightenment, to benefit all beings. He doesn't use that. That's me. He is not really talking about fuel and engines in 14th century Tibet. But yeah. So then he says these sorts of things arise from certain circumstances. I think this is possibly a little bit repetitive, but he's going for a very, very specific. So, for instance, non-harming of living beings, a non-violent attitude leads to a long lifespan. Giving light, giving clothing, being generous gives a good appearance. Coming from a good family is from a lack of pride, how developing a humility, and always having a high regard for teachers, and respecting others, and being able to respect others as their equals, or as an equal, or even as their servant, in terms of being able to serve their needs. Cause of power is to do with giving to those who ask for them, even or even giving when they're not asked for, helping with assistance, and giving to those who suffer. So being able to alleviate suffering from people, especially those who are homeless, like refugees, political refugees, or suffering with no possessions for whatever reason. Trustworthy words is habitually having given up the four vocal non-virtues of lying, slander, and so on. The renown is to do with having continually considered very carefully about the prayers to benefit all beings, making offerings to the Triple Gem, making offerings to one's parents, to the family, and also to one's teachers. So again, in terms of autonomy and independence, is being able to develop an autonomous, a strong mind, being able to feel able to go out and deal with issues independently with initiative. Strength is accomplishing what others cannot be done, assisting others and collaborating with others in terms of working with people in a team and helping within a team, if you like, with that situation. Of course, this is very true in monastic situations. You have some monks who are very, very good at working with a group and helping out with a group, others who are much who find that much harder. And then the other thing is to say is, well, why we are aspiring to be enlightened, yeah? Well, we're working towards enlightenment. We're doing these things to do them with hoping to get wealthy, hoping to get beautiful, hoping to get all these things. If we have that fruition, if we hope for that, then the quality of the action is diminished in terms of the path. So this is like what we want to do is to dedicate any benefit towards enlightenment, right? And in order to benefit all beings. And by doing that, by saying, I'm not doing this for anything I want, I'm doing this because I want to benefit all beings. This has a dramatic effect in terms of the what's known as a pure attitude towards oneself. And then the other attitude directed towards oneself, a pure attitude, is just the intense power to from the doing these things from the depths of one heart, to meaningfully, sincerely. Then those which are other directed pure attitudes in terms of these are abandoning jealousy, competitiveness, and contempt when you see practitioners who are better, equal, or less than yourself. So yeah, jealousy for those who are better, competitiveness with those who are equal, and contempt for those who are beneath us, if you like. If we have this attitude, if we develop this any of these three, then it weakens our pure attitude as a sincere practitioner. We're uh, being involved in a social game, which of a hierarchy, which is not of any value. Instead, if we could admire them for being sincere practitioners, regardless of whether they're higher, medium, or lower than us, then this is a very pure attitude. So this is a much better for us to do it. And again, even if we're unable to do everything, thinking as much as we can every day about how good it would be if we can. So this is the idea of saying, I want to be able to do this, is good for us. So, okay, yeah, we're right towards the end again. I got my timing right. So other directed pure application, there's also pure application, self-directed and other directed, is applying ourselves. Self-directed is working to cultivate virtue without interruption, with great intensity. From moment to moment, we're looking to have our mind informed in terms of informing our mind in terms of correct application, virtuous activity. From moment to moment, this this strength, this is what's known as pure application. Other directed is causing those who have not or helping, assisting those who are not clear about what it is they should do, to think about it, to help develop their sense of conscientiousness, their awareness, and to help develop an ethical framework for them, so that they can see anyway for themselves what um, the importance of virtuous action. Again, within their own views, yeah, within their own religious or the spiritual path is fine. Obviously, you might not want to encourage as Buddhist, actions such as sacrificing animals, but within that, there's still plenty of plenty of things that we can encourage. And he says basically this is known as the pure field, this attitude and the application of this pure application and pure attitudes of working for just sincerely for the path. He said this is what leads us to pure land. So yeah, pure land is like a heaven, but is where it's focused on us becoming Buddha. It's a very powerful, very fast way for us to become fully enlightened, to benefit all beings. So this also is like really where what we're aiming for in terms of our accumulation of merit to be in terms of our journey on the spiritual path. Okay, so that's the end of um, the fruitions of karma, and the next is a chapter on how, which I think we'll do in 1 week next week, on how to address what we've done in a way which can help mitigate the effects. It doesn't stop them, but it certainly helps mitigate them. Right? So it's quite an intense session. Um, Hopefully there's something there that was of benefit to us. Useful for me to go through. And any merit again that I've done from speaking, listening, reading, studying, preparing, and delivering, or that we've achieved through this session, I strongly dedicate any benefits at all of this and all my actions to the same single purpose of sacrificing my own self-interests or thoughts to all beings in order to become a Buddha, such that I can continue to offer um, happiness and diminish suffering. Nothing else seems to me to have very much value right now. So that's probably good. So in let's meditate just again for a minute or so. On maybe take a thought of things in the last day or two, or in the next day or two, and how we can work to offer virtuous activity.